after the Delta Airlines plane flipped over while landing at Pearson International Airport in Toronto, Canada. It has now been reported the Delta flight was operated by Endeavour Air, who has a history of boasting about unmanned flights, but not drones, just planes staffed entirely by women, as Endeavour Air's website lists their most important behaviors, with safety on top, but also promoting diversity and inclusion in all aspects of their airline. And sadly, this is just the cycle we'll likely see after every catastrophe going forward. The right will dig up their company's push for diversity and inclusion, and the left will ignore that and just try to pin this on President Trump. The real question being, what exactly caused this crash, and how can we prevent it again? As obviously some things can be blamed on the lowering of standards for employment just for the sake of promoting diversity, but not everything can be attributed to it, as Endeavour Air's social media posts featuring their all-female crews are getting bombarded with basically the same response over and over again until they had to turn off the replies. But in actuality, there is no evidence this particular flight into Toronto had no men, and Endeavour's roster of female pilots is actually pretty standard for the industry, so a lot of things can be chalked up to who they hired to run their social media, as I've known people that work at those firms that run social media accounts for celebrities and companies, and they're the exact types that would try to highlight DEI beyond the levels of diversity the company actually contained. As one, they have a full sense of what consumers actually find important, as oftentimes they themselves live in these liberal bubbles on social media, where they genuinely believe people pick airplanes based on the pilot's race, gender, and preferences in bed. But two, social media accounts are deceptive by design, as nobody posts their reality, they only post what they want you to think. The problem being, how much of this company's money and focus are going into promoting this image of themselves, as opposed to what should be their top priority in safety. As the speculation is, and we have no way of confirming this right now, but I blurred out the images for privacy just in case. But the first officer on that flight allegedly just got her license a month ago, and the air traffic control flight recording had the captain on the radio during the landing. If true, this sounds like some pretty important information. If only Delta Airlines would verify if this is what possibly caused that crash, we would know if they're making the correct preventative measures for next time. But their silence is very telling, which is what makes me think they're doing the same thing they did with the Black Hawk helicopter crash in DC, as that was in everybody's news feed for about a week, but we never got definitive answers as to who was flying, why they were so high, and why there was only one ATC working what should have been two roles. They just waited out the news cycle until everybody started talking about Trump's constitutional crisis and hope we'd forget.
Constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
A constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
And the sad part is, if Delta just keeps their head down for a bit, I imagine the public, for the most part, will just forget and move on. But this isn't how we should treat airline safety. As I covered it in the last video that is now mysteriously gone, I don't know what happened, but let's just do a super brief recap. The crash occurred and the left immediately tried to blame Trump for what happened in Canada. NBC echoed that sentiment.
I did want to, underscore, to pick up on the conversation you were just having, though, in terms of the recent string of aviation incidents, Tom. This is going to, yet again, raise the concern about FAA staffing, air traffic control staffing. Now, this is a Canadian air traffic control tower, and this is under Canadian authority once it crosses the border. And yet, as you know, there has been this talk about maybe staff cuts at the FAA as a part of President Trump's effort to trim down the federal workforce. And yet, as you also know, the FAA has been complaining for years that they are understaffed in critical job positions, especially air traffic control.
Until it came out that nobody in safety was let go of.
The AP reporting that their employees that are being laid off are on probationary status, so it's easier to lay them off because they're still on probation. They include radar, landing, and navigational aid maintenance. But isn't there already a shortage at the FAA? Why do this now, especially considering what's happened in the States, and now, of course, you have this other incident and a few others.
Yeah, well, this one happened in Canada, but
Yes.
I can only tell you what the Secretary of Transportation says. There are 45,000 employees at the FAA. We're talking about fewer than 400 people, and he says 0 air traffic controllers and critical safety personnel were let go. So if that's true, I don't really have a problem with it, to be honest with you. I do like the idea of keeping the people who are in the direct chain of command of safety and the air traffic control system and so on and so forth. But I have a hard time believing that there is a single government agency that doesn't have a bloat of administrative personnel that we could probably do without. And I think that's why a lot of voters are happy that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are finally going through the federal government and trying to take out some of this bureaucracy that we probably just don't need. So I'm reading to you what Sean Duffy says. He's the Secretary of the Transportation. I have no reason to doubt his numbers.
Not to mention the initial point that this occurred in Canada, which isn't where our FAA operates, it's Canada's TCAA. But the left's rationalization doesn't have to make sense. It just has to end on blaming Trump. And with that in mind, I don't want to turn into the right's version of leftist delusion, where absolutely everybody gets their job and results of forced inclusion. As for all we know, these ladies could be the very top of their class with tens of thousands of flight hours. Because sadly, all these DEI initiatives just make minority accomplishments questionable. But the only way to fix that is when a company focuses purely on skills with zero emphasis on inclusion. As when you see a female lead engineer at SpaceX, you know she's the best of the best and earned that position. But if she was a lead engineer at Delta, it's sadly going to be seen with a little bit of skepticism, as even on their own website, they measure their success through representation, sharing graphs about how many women they employ at each level, putting out social media posts about all the women they have on their flights. And even to today, posting on their planes how they're the best DEI place to work for disability inclusion. You would assume between 2023 and now, they would think to remove all this DEI branding, especially whenever something goes wrong. It brings these companies so much criticism that they actually have to block the comments from the public. Because I understand, although releasing the information on who was doing what inside that airplane could exonerate Endeavor or Delta's DEI policies, but you also don't want to name individuals as you don't want the angry online mobs coming after them. But as long as these companies keep emphasizing inclusion on the front end and refusing to acknowledge or even blocking any criticism on the back end, people are always going to assume the worst. When all I want is for them to identify whatever caused the accident and let us know how they can fix it. But if you appreciate my concise, lighthearted commentary on the tragic status that is today's reality, hopefully I've earned your subscription, then go check out the video on how they finally pushed inclusion out of the military.